Delaney Cross was once a Michelin-starred head chef. Yet through 5 years of marriage, she was trampled by her husband and his family like a broken thing, all because she couldn't bear a child. What none of them knew was that the one man who had quietly watched over her for years was the most powerful crime boss in Chicago, a man who never repeated an order twice, and who despised nothing on earth more than a man who abuses a woman. Before the story begins, don't forget to comment the city where you're watching this video, and enjoy the story. Delaney stepped into the apartment with a bag of groceries and froze. A strange woman was lounging on her sofa, one hand resting smugly on a pregnant belly. "Grant, who is she?" Her husband strolled out, casual as if introducing a piece of merchandise. "Delaney, this is Sienna. We took her for an ultrasound today. It's a boy. The family has decided to keep this baby. You don't have any objection, do you?" She went numb. 5 years she had given up a brilliant career to serve his parents, and now he had brought another woman home, brazenly. Her in-laws lowered their eyes. They had known all along. "This wouldn't have happened if you'd given me a child," Grant said with contempt. "A barren woman like you, what right do you have to be jealous?" Sienna hid a soft laugh behind her hand. "Delaney, men just crave something new. But me, I can give him a son." Then he hurled her luggage out the door. "Take it and get out. No home, no job, not even $100 to your name. How will you survive out there, begging on the street?" Delaney picked up her bags, straightened her back, and walked out without shedding a single tear. What the entire Whitmore family failed to realize was this: the woman they had just thrown away had never been the broken one, and on the other side of the city, in a dim room where all of Chicago held its breath the moment he entered, a man set down a file bearing her face, the one person he had been waiting years to see again. The rain over Chicago had turned to a fine gray mist by the time Delaney Cross carried the last of her belongings up 4 flights of a stairwell that smelled of damp concrete and someone else's fried onions. The studio apartment she had found was barely the size of the walk-in pantry she once commanded, a single window looking out on a brick wall, a mattress on the floor, a 2-burner stove with one coil that no longer glowed. She set her bag down and sat on the edge of the mattress, and, for a long while, did not move. In the pocket of her coat was everything she had left to her name, and when she counted it out on the floorboards, smoothing each crumpled note flat with her palm, it came to $87, and some coins that rolled under the radiator where she did not have the heart to chase them. 5 years. 5 years she had given the Whitmore family, rising before dawn to cook Harold's eggs exactly the way his late mother once had, learning Margaret's blood pressure medications by heart, biting her tongue through every dinner where Grant introduced her to his colleagues as merely his wife, as though the word carried no history at all. She had folded herself smaller and smaller to fit inside their house, and in the end they had thrown her out the way one throws out a chair that no longer matches the room. But sitting there in the cold, Delaney did not cry, because somewhere beneath the exhaustion, a thing she had buried for a very long time had begun, quietly, to stir. She closed her eyes, and she was 23 again, standing in a kitchen ablaze with copper light and the roar of 10 burners, her whites crisp, her knife an extension of her own hand. She could still feel the weight of that night when the inspectors came, could still hear the hush that fell over the pass as the head server carried the news back, like a man carrying fire in his bare hands, and she remembered how she had pressed a trembling fist to her mouth when they told her the restaurant had earned its star, and that the youngest person in that room to have earned one was her. She had built dishes that made grown critics set down their pens and simply stare. She had been courted by hotels in 3 cities, and then she had met Grant Whitmore, handsome and certain and full of promises about a family and a future, and she had done the one thing she swore she never would, which was to take off her whites and hang them in a closet and tell herself that love was a fair trade for a flame. She had let them convince her that a woman's worth was measured in the children she gave a man, and when the years passed and no child came, She had let them convince her that the failure was hers alone, that her body was the broken thing, never once suspecting the truth that would one day tear their whole world open. Now, in a room she could cross in 4 steps, Delaney opened her eyes and looked at her own hands, the small scars along her knuckles, the burn mark on her wrist. She had earned pulling a tray from an oven at 19, and she understood something with the clarity of a blade drawn across a whetstone. They had taken her home, her marriage, her name in that family, but there was one thing they had never been able to touch, one thing that had lived in her hands all along, while they mistook her for nothing but a tired woman who cooked their meals. She rose, filled a dented pot from the tap, set it on the single working coil, and while the water climbed slowly toward a boil she began, out of nothing but salt and flour and the memory of who she had been, to make herself a plate of food fit for the chef she still was. And as the steam rose and the first real warmth of the day touched her face, Delaney Cross made herself a promise in the silence that the woman the Whitmores had thrown into the street would walk back into their lives one day, and when she did, not one of them would recognize her. It was 3 days later, in the thin light of a Tuesday morning, that a soft knock came at the door of the studio, so hesitant that Delaney almost mistook it for the pipes. When she opened it, she found Margaret Whitmore standing in the hallway in her good gray coat, a canvas bag clutched against her chest, her face drawn and apologetic, glancing back down the stairwell as though she feared being followed. For a moment neither of them spoke, and then the older woman's chin began to tremble and she said, in a voice gone small, that she had told Harold she was going to her doctor's appointment, that she had taken 2 buses and walked the last stretch in the cold because she could not bear another night, not knowing whether Delaney was warm, whether she was eating, whether she was alive. Delaney stepped aside and let her in, and Margaret set the bag on the little counter and began unpacking it with shaking hands. A container of the chicken and dumplings Delaney had once taught her to make properly, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a small jar of the fig preserves she knew Delaney loved, and with each item she laid down her tears fell faster, until at last she pressed both hands to her mouth and wept openly. Delaney had not expected this, and something in her chest that she had spent 3 days hardening began, treacherously, to soften. Margaret lowered herself onto the edge of the single chair and looked up with red-rimmed eyes and said that she was so sorry, that she had known and said nothing, that she had been a coward in her own house for 40 years and had watched them do this to the only person who had ever treated her like a mother rather than a burden. Delaney knelt in front of her and took the trembling hands in her own, because whatever the Whitmore name had come to mean, this woman had once held her when she cried, had once slipped extra money into her coat pocket without a word, had been the single warm light in a house full of cold rooms. But then Margaret's grip tightened, and her weeping shifted into something else, into pleading, and she began to beg. She begged Delaney not to go through with the divorce, said that Grant was foolish and weak, but that he could change, that Sienna was a passing madness, that a marriage was a thing you did not throw away over one terrible season, that if Delaney only came back and gave it time the family would come to their senses and everything could be as it was. She said that a woman on her own in a city this size had no shield against the world, and that she could not sleep for imagining what would become of her. And there, kneeling on the cold floor of a room that could hold nothing of her old life, Delaney felt the last thread inside her go quiet and still. She lifted Margaret's chin gently the way one might a child's, and she told her, without anger and without tears, that she loved her, that she would always love her, that whatever else was severed between herself and that family, Margaret would remain hers to care for as long as she drew breath, but she would not go back. She said it once, softly, and did not repeat it, because some sentences lose their truth the moment they are said twice. She told Margaret that the woman who had stood in that house and let herself be called broken was already gone, that she had left her somewhere on the stairs of this building 3 nights ago and did not intend to go looking for her. Margaret searched her face for a long moment, hoping to find the old pliancy there, the softness that could be persuaded, and finding something new and unbending and quiet as tempered steel instead, she understood at last that she was speaking to a different person entirely. She rose, gathered her empty bag, kissed Delaney's forehead with lips that shook, and at the door she turned and whispered that whatever happened, she prayed the world would finally be kind to her, and then she was gone, and Delaney stood alone in the silence with the warmth of the bread still rising into the cold air between them. After Margaret's footsteps faded down the stairwell, Delaney sat by the window with the cooling bread untouched, and a memory she had kept locked away for the better part of 2 years rose unbidden and would not be pushed back down. It had been a spring afternoon when she finally worked up the courage to go alone to a women's clinic across the city, telling no one, paying in cash so that no record would find its way back to the house, because after 3 years of Grant's family measuring her worth by an empty cradle she had needed, for her own sanity, to know the truth. She remembered the coolness of the examination room, the kindness of the doctor who had gone through every test with careful thoroughness, and she remembered most of all the woman's gentle certainty when she sat across from her afterward and told her that there was nothing wrong with her at all, that her body was healthy, that by every measure she was perfectly capable of carrying a child. Delaney had walked out into the sunlight that day, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted and set upon her all at once, because the news meant something she was not ready to name, something that pointed away from herself and toward the man she had married. She had gone home that evening, and, choosing her words with the care of someone stepping across thin ice, had suggested that perhaps they might both see a specialist together, that these things were rarely one person's burden alone. She remembered how Grant's face had darkened, how he had risen from his chair. She told her coldly that there was nothing wrong with the Whitmore men, that his father had fathered sons, and his grandfather before him, that the problem was hers, and hers alone, and he would not have himself insulted in his own home. He had found a new excuse every time she raised it after that. A work trip, a headache, a sudden fury that ended the conversation before it began, until she stopped raising it at all, and let them go on believing what they wished to believe, because she had learned that some men would rather burn down a marriage than look at a single truth about themselves. Sitting now in the gray light of the studio, Delaney understood that she had carried that knowledge like a stone in her pocket for 2 years, and that she had let them shame her for a thing that was never hers, and the quiet anger of it settled in her chest not as heat, but as resolve. It was in that exact moment, as if the world had been waiting for her to finally stop apologizing for her own existence, that her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go, but something made her answer, and a crisp, professional voice on the other end asked whether she was speaking with Delaney Cross, the chef who had once earned a star for a restaurant called Meridian. When she said that she was, the voice grew warmer and introduced itself as calling on behalf of Castellanos, and at the sound of that name, Delaney's breath caught, because there was not a serious cook in the city of Chicago who did not know it. The legendary dining room that had once been the crown jewel of fine cuisine in the entire Midwest. The voice explained that the restaurant was searching for a new head chef, that her name had come up in their considerations, and that the ownership wished to invite her personally to interview for the position, with an offer of pay and benefits that made Delaney sit down slowly on the edge of the mattress. She asked, hardly trusting her own voice, when they would like her to come, and the voice told her the following morning at 8 o'clock sharp, if she was able. Delaney looked around the tiny room, at the $80-some still lying on the floorboards, at the closet where a pair of chef's whites had hung untouched for 5 long years, and she closed her eyes and said, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she would be there. The next morning, Delaney arrived at Castellanos a full quarter-hour early, standing on the sidewalk in her one good coat, and looking up at the tall, dark facade of the building, the brass letters of its name catching the pale winter sun, and she drew a slow breath before pushing through the heavy doors into a dining room that took her breath away with its quiet grandeur, the vaulted ceilings, the aged mahogany, the crystal that threw soft fractures of light across white linen even at this early hour. A young woman with a clipboard led her to a small waiting area near the pass, where two other candidates already sat, and Delaney had just settled into her chair and begun to steady her nerves when a familiar voice cut across the room like a blade, and every muscle in her body went rigid. Sienna Blake came sweeping through the far archway in a tailored dress that did nothing to hide the gentle curve of her pregnancy, a lanyard around her neck marking her as staff, and when her eyes landed on Delaney, they widened for an instant in genuine surprise, before narrowing into something cold and delighted. She crossed the floor slowly, savoring each step, and stopped before Delaney with her head tilted, and said in a voice pitched loud enough for the whole room to hear that she could hardly believe her eyes, that the washed-up little housewife had actually crawled all the way to Castellano's looking for scraps. Delaney rose from her chair, and it was only then, looking at the lanyard and the way the waiting staff straightened when Sienna passed, that the full weight of the situation settled over her, because Sienna was not a guest here, or a visitor, but the operations manager of the very restaurant she had come to for salvation, and she would be the one deciding who walked out with the position. And Sienna saw the realization cross Delaney's face and smiled like a cat that had cornered a bird, and she said that it was a small world indeed, that she happened to be running the hiring for the kitchen personally, and that she was ever so curious to hear how a woman who had spent the last 5 years washing her husband's father's dishes intended to run the most demanding kitchen in the city. The two other candidates shifted uncomfortably, and one of them, a young man barely out of culinary school, glanced between the two women with dawning unease. Delaney kept her voice level and said only that she was here to interview like anyone else, and that she would be grateful for a fair chance to do so, but Sienna laughed softly and told her that fairness was a luxury for people with something to offer, and that she would be doing her a kindness by ending this embarrassment before it went any further. She turned to the young man and asked him brightly about his training, listening with exaggerated attention as he stammered through his credentials, and then she turned back to Delaney with mock sweetness and asked her to introduce herself, to tell the room exactly what qualifications a stay-at-home wife thought she could bring to a place like this. Delaney felt every eye in the room turn toward her, and she understood in that moment that Sienna intended to strip her bare in public, to humiliate her so thoroughly that she would gather her coat and flee, and she also understood, with a strange cold calm settling over her, that Sienna had made a critical mistake, because in her contempt, she had forgotten to ask a single question about what Delaney had actually done before she ever became a Whitmore. And so Delaney did not flinch and did not lower her eyes, but stood a little straighter and said, in a voice that carried its own quiet authority through the beautiful old room, that her name was Delaney Cross, and that before she was anyone's wife she had earned a star for a restaurant when she was 23 years old, and that if Miss Blake truly wished to end an embarrassment quickly, she was welcome to bring her a knife, a cutting board, and any protein in the walk-in, and let the work speak for itself. A hush fell over the waiting area, the young candidate's mouth actually falling open, and Sienna's smile faltered for just a heartbeat before she recovered it. But in that flicker Delaney saw the first small crack appear, and she knew the ground beneath the woman's feet had just begun, invisibly, to shift. Sienna had opened her mouth to deliver some cutting reply, when the atmosphere of the entire room changed in an instant, the way the air changes before a storm, and every member of the staff went suddenly still. The heavy doors at the far end of the dining room had swung open, and a man walked in flanked by two others who moved with the quiet watchfulness of men whose only job was him, and Delaney felt rather than understood that this was someone before whom the whole city held its breath. He was tall and moved without hurry, dressed in a dark three-piece suit, cut so precisely it seemed part of him, his black hair swept back from a face that was handsome in a severe and unsmiling way, a faint scar tracing the line of his jaw, and his eyes, when they swept the room, were a pale, cold gray that missed nothing. The clipboard girl dropped into something like a bow. The waiters found sudden, urgent tasks for their hands, and even Sienna, who moments ago had commanded the room, smoothed her dress and arranged her features into deference. This was Dominic Castellano, the man they called Nico, and though not one word of what he truly was had ever been said aloud in that dining room, everyone in it understood that the restaurant, the building, and a great many things beyond both, belonged to him and to the name his family carried through the shadowed arteries of Chicago. He had come, though none of the candidates knew it, because Castellanos was not merely a business to him, but the last living thing his mother had left behind, the dining room she had built with her own hands, and her own recipes before illness took her, and it had been sliding quietly toward ruin for 2 years, and he had resolved that he would not stand by and watch her legacy die. Gio Fontana, the man at his right shoulder, murmured something and handed him a slim folder of the day's candidates, and Nico took it and began to read as he walked, and it was when his eyes fell upon a single name on the 3rd page that his measured steps came, very briefly, to a halt. He read the name again, Delaney Cross, and beneath it the restaurant Meridian and the year of the star, and a memory surfaced in him that he had turned over in the dark of many nights, a private dinner years ago, arranged to make peace between his family and another, a night that could easily have ended in blood. And how the food that came out of that kitchen had been so extraordinary that hardened men had set down their grievances and simply eaten, and how he had gone back to thank the chef and found a young woman with tired, kind eyes and scarred hands, who had no idea that her cooking had kept the peace and very possibly saved his life. He had asked her name that night and never forgotten it, and had wondered in the years since what had become of her, and now here it was on a page in his hands. He looked up and found her across the room, and though 5 years had worn her down, he knew her at once, and something in his cold gray eyes shifted by a degree that only Gio, who knew him best, could have detected. He walked to the waiting area, and Sienna stepped forward brightly to tell him that she had the hiring well in hand, and that this particular candidate was regrettably unqualified, a mere housewife with no serious experience. But Nico did not so much as glance at her, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and even, and carried the weight of a closing door. He said that he would conduct this interview himself. He asked Delaney to follow him, and she rose and walked past a Sienna gone pale and rigid, and in his private office he set the folder down and looked at her for a long moment before asking her a single genuine question about how she would bring a dying kitchen back to life, and Delaney, forgetting for the first time in years to make herself small, answered him fully and without fear, speaking of flavor and discipline and memory, as though the fire in her had never once gone out. When she finished, he was silent, and then he said simply that the position was hers, that she would start as head chef the following morning, and as Delaney walked back out through the dining room with her chin lifted, she passed Sienna still standing frozen where she had left her, and understood that the world had just, quietly and completely, begun to turn. Delaney's first week in the kitchen at Castellanos should have been a homecoming, the return of a woman to the only place she had ever truly belonged, but Sienna had not spent years learning to smile while sharpening a knife for nothing, and she struck back in the way she knew best, not with open confrontation, but with poison poured slowly into 100 ears. It began with whispers, a comment here to a line cook, a story there to a server on a smoke break, and within days, the kitchen that Delaney was trying to rebuild had turned into a gauntlet she had to walk through every morning. She would arrive before dawn and feel the conversations stop when she entered, feel the eyes slide over her and away, and she would catch the fragments they meant her to catch. That this was the woman whose own husband had thrown her out. That no man keeps a wife who cannot give him a single child in 5 years of marriage. That a woman like that must be cold, or cursed, or broken somewhere deep inside. And worst of all, in Sienna's most careful telling, that Delaney was a bitter homewrecker who had come to Castellanos chasing a wealthy man after ruining her own marriage through her failures as a wife. Sienna had even seen to it that the story spread beyond the walls of the restaurant, a few well-placed messages, a post shared among the tight network of hospitality workers in the city, painting Delaney as a scheming woman who had clawed her way into the kitchen through the owner's favor, rather than her own hands, and by the end of the week there were people in that building who looked at her with open contempt before she had ever exchanged a word with them. A younger cook named Petra, barely 20, actually asked her to her face one morning whether it was true that she had been cast out for being unable to bear children, as though it were the most natural question in the world, and Delaney felt the old familiar heat rise into her cheeks. The shame that the Whitmores had spent years teaching her to feel, the instinct to shrink and apologize for the shape of her own life. But she was not the same woman who had folded herself smaller inside that cold house, and she looked at the girl and said only that a person's worth was not measured by what her body did or did not do, but by what her hands could make, and then she turned back to her station and said nothing more. That became her answer to all of it, the whispers and the sideways looks and the cruel little stories. Not argument, not tears, but work, and she poured herself into that kitchen with a ferocity that left no room for anything else. She rebuilt the station rotations, retrained the sauciers who had grown lazy, spent her own unpaid hours, late into the night stripping the menu down to its bones, and building it back into something worthy of the name over the door. And slowly, dish by dish, the food coming out of that pass began to change. The line cooks who had whispered about her found themselves standing straighter under her hand, learning things they had not known they could do, and one by one, the ones with real hearts began to fall quiet in a different way, not out of scorn, but out of a grudging awe. Sienna watched all of this from her office, with a smile that grew thinner by the day, because the reputation she had so carefully built to bury the woman was proving no match for the simple, stubborn fact of Delaney's talent, and every plate that left that kitchen more beautiful than the last was, in its own way, an answer that no rumor could shout down. Delaney went home each night to her tiny room, bone-tired and hollowed out, and there were nights she sat on the edge of the mattress and let herself feel the full weight of how alone she was. But each morning she rose again in the dark and went back, because she had learned the one thing that the people trying to break her had never understood, that the surest way to silence those who call you nothing is to become, quietly and completely, something they can no longer ignore. It was on a Thursday evening, in the middle of the dinner rush with the pass roaring around her, that Delaney's phone buzzed against the steel of her station with a call from a number she had not seen in weeks, and something cold moved through her before she even answered it. It was Margaret's neighbor, breathless and frightened, saying that there had been a terrible commotion at the Whitmore house, that Margaret had collapsed, that the family was arguing and no one seemed to be doing anything, and that she did not know who else to call. Delaney did not remember pulling off her apron, or telling her sous chef to take the pass, only that she was suddenly in a taxi with her heart slamming against her ribs, and the whole way across the city she pieced together from the neighbor's frightened account what had happened. That Sienna had grown bolder since being crossed at the restaurant, and had gone to the Whitmore house that evening to complain of Delaney, and that Harold, humiliated and enraged that his cast-off daughter-in-law had somehow landed on her feet, had turned that fury on the nearest target, which as always was his wife. Margaret, it seemed, had done the one thing she rarely dared to do, which was to speak up, to say that they had all been cruel, and that Delaney had done nothing to deserve any of it, and Harold had shouted her down, and Sienna had joined in, the two of them pressing on the frightened old woman until her hand had gone to her chest and she had folded quietly to the floor. When Delaney burst through the front door of the house that had once been her prison, she found a scene that turned her blood to ice. Margaret gray-faced and gasping on the sofa, one hand clutched to her breastbone, and Harold standing over her not with tenderness but with irritation, saying that she was overreacting, that these episodes of hers were always for attention, that they would wait and see if it passed before spending good money on an ambulance, and a hospital that would only invent a dozen expensive things wrong with her. Grant stood uselessly by the window, and Sienna sat in an armchair with her arms folded, murmuring that hospitals these days robbed people blind, and that surely the old woman just needed to lie down. Delaney crossed the room in 3 strides, and dropped to her knees beside Margaret, and one look at the blue tinge creeping into her lips, and the cold sweat on her brow told her everything she needed to know, that this was no performance, and that every second they stood arguing was a second stolen from a life. She rounded on the three of them, this family that had thrown her away. She told them in a voice that cracked like a whip that they could stand there counting their dollars while their own mother died on the sofa if they wished. Still, she was taking her to the hospital now, and she gathered the frail woman into her arms with a strength she did not know she had, and half carried her out to the taxi still idling at the curb. At the hospital she did not hesitate, did not calculate, did not think of the small sum of money she had scraped together over her weeks at the restaurant, but pressed her own card into the hands of the admitting nurse, and told them to do everything, that the cost was hers to bear, and then she stood outside the treatment room, with her hands pressed to her mouth, and prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in. Harold and Grant arrived nearly an hour later, having finally deigned to follow, and when the doctor emerged to say that they had gotten her there just in time, that a delay of even a little longer might have cost the woman her life, it was to Delaney that Margaret's frightened eyes turned when they let the family in to see her. Delaney, whose hand she gripped, Delaney's name she whispered through the oxygen mask. And Harold, standing at the foot of the bed, had the grace at least to look, for one brief moment, ashamed, though he said nothing, and Grant would not meet Delaney's eyes at all, and Sienna had not come at all. Delaney stayed the whole night in the plastic chair beside the bed, holding the hand of the one person in that family who had ever loved her, and somewhere in the small dark hours she understood that kindness, real kindness, was not weakness, but the last thing they would ever be able to take from her, and that she would go on giving it even to people who had earned none of it, because that was the difference between her and every person who had ever tried to break her. 2 mornings later, Grant Whitmore made the mistake of coming to Castellanos. He had learned from Margaret's careless gratitude that Delaney had paid for the hospital, and rather than shame, that knowledge had curdled in him into a strange, resentful fury, the anger of a small man who cannot stand to be indebted to someone he has spent years telling himself is beneath him, and he came to the restaurant in the gray hour before service to confront her, to demand somehow that she stop making him look small by being kinder than he was. He found her at the loading entrance signing for the morning's deliveries, and he did not lower his voice, did not care who heard, but began to berate her in the alley, calling her a manipulative woman who had wormed her way into a rich man's kitchen, telling her that everyone could see what she was really after, that a barren, cast-off wife had no business playing at being a chef, that she should crawl back to whatever hole she had come from before she embarrassed herself further. What Grant did not know, because men like him never bother to learn the shape of the rooms they walk into, was that Dominic Castellano had arrived early that morning, as he often did, and that he was standing just inside the open service door, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, listening to every word. Nico did not move at first, and his stillness was more terrible than any shout, the stillness of a man who has spent his life deciding the fates of others, and finds himself deciding one now. There were few things in the world that Dominic Castellano truly despised, but at the very top of that short and absolute list stood the particular kind of man who raised his voice or his hand against a woman who could not strike back, the coward who mistook cruelty for strength, and everything in his cold gray composure hardened as he watched this soft-handed man try to make himself feel large by making Delaney feel small. He set his coffee down on a shelf without a sound and stepped out into the gray light of the alley, and the moment his shadow fell across the scene, Grant's tirade died in his throat. Nico did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply looked at Grant Whitmore, a long, unhurried look from those pale eyes, and in that look was the full and unspoken weight of everything the man was, and everything the name Castellano meant in the city of Chicago, and Grant, who understood nothing about cooking or kindness, understood that particular language perfectly, the way prey understands the presence of a predator. Nico said only, in a voice quiet enough that Delaney barely heard it, that the man was standing on private property and that he had perhaps 10 seconds to become a memory, and Grant went white and stammered something and was gone from the alley before the 10 seconds were up, half stumbling in his hurry to be anywhere else. Delaney stood there with her clipboard still in her hands, uncertain what to say, and Nico turned to her and studied her for a moment, and then he did a thing that surprised her, which was that he stepped back rather than closer. He told her that he had heard she had faced a great deal of talk in his kitchen these past weeks, and that he wanted her to understand something clearly, that he would not intervene in it, that he would not fight her battles at the pass, or silence her doubters by decree, because a kitchen followed only one authority in the end, and it was not his but hers, and it was one she would have to win with her own hands and no one else's, and that if he shielded her now she would never truly command the respect she was owed. Delaney looked at him and understood the strange gift he was giving her, the hard mercy of being allowed to prove herself, and she nodded. What she did not know, and would not learn for some time, was that the very same afternoon Nico had quietly sent Gio to the hospital's billing office to settle every remaining cent of Margaret Whitmore's care, arranging it through a shell so buried that it could never be traced back to him, so that a woman who had spent her last savings to save someone else's mother would never carry that weight, and would never know from whom the kindness had come. It was near midnight, nearly 2 weeks later, when Delaney finally set down her knife after a long day spent perfecting a new tasting menu, and she looked up to find that the only other light still burning in the vast dark building came from Nico's office, where he too had lingered over the restaurant's troubled accounts, long after everyone else had gone home. He emerged as she was pulling on her coat, and offered without ceremony to walk her out and see her safely home, and she accepted, and together they made their way through the silent dining room toward the front, only to find the great doors locked fast, the night manager long gone, and the keys with him. Nico said there was another way, that a service stair led down through the cellar to an exit that opened on the rear lot where his car was parked, and he pushed open a narrow door and led her down a flight of stone steps into the old wine cellar beneath the restaurant, a low vaulted space of brick and shadow lit only by a single bare bulb. Delaney felt it the moment they descended, the low ceiling pressing down, the thick air, the way the walls seemed to lean inward, and her breath began to come short and quick, her heart hammering against her ribs for no reason she could name to a stranger. Nico noticed at once, because noticing was the thing he did better than anyone alive, and he turned and saw the sheen of panic on her face, and asked her quietly what was wrong. She did not want to say it, the small, shameful truth she had carried since childhood, but the words came out of her anyway, that she could not bear enclosed spaces, that something in her broke apart in rooms with no sky, and she braced for the flicker of contempt she had learned to expect from men when she showed them a weakness. It did not come. Instead, Nico stepped closer, and his voice dropped low and even, and he told her to look at him, and only at him, not at the walls, not at the ceiling, only at him, and he named the things around them slowly, the smell of old oak, the cool of the brick, the sound of her own steady breath, until the racing of her heart began, degree by degree, to slow. It was in that moment, with her eyes fixed on his, and the panic finally loosening its grip, that they both heard it, the scrape of a foot on stone somewhere in the dark beyond the reach of the single bulb, and Nico's entire bearing changed in an instant, the gentleness vanishing, his body turning to place himself squarely between Delaney and the sound before she had even registered the danger. 2 men stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the cellar, hard-faced and unhurried, and though Delaney did not know them, she felt Nico go very still and very cold beside her, and she understood that these were not thieves or drunks who had wandered in, but something far more deliberate. One of them spoke, a low, mocking greeting, addressing Nico by name, and saying that the Marchetti family sent their regards, and had merely wished to see whether the great Castellano still worked so late and so carelessly, and Nico answered in a voice like a blade sliding from its sheath, that they had wandered a long way onto ground that did not belong to them, and that they should carry their regards back before they lost the ability to. For a long taut moment the cellar held its breath, and Delaney felt Nico's hand find her arm and ease her a step further behind him, his whole frame a wall of stillness ready to become something else. And then the two men, having seen what they came to see, backed slowly into the dark with their eyes never leaving him, and were gone up some other stair. Nico did not relax until their footsteps had faded entirely, and then he turned to her and asked, with a strange quiet urgency, whether she was all right, and Delaney nodded, though she did not fully understand what she had just witnessed. What neither of them could have known, standing there in the cellar with their hearts still racing for two entirely different reasons, was that the small incident that night, this brush between Castellano and Marchetti blood with an unknown woman caught in the middle, would travel by whisper up through the shadowed hierarchy of the city, and would one day be laid before Nico's father as proof of a danger that an old Don would not soon forgive. When they climbed back up out of the cellar, they found that the rear exit too had been bolted from the outside, some failure of the night's locking up, and Nico, after a moment's consideration, said that there was little sense in forcing a door at this hour and drawing the wrong kind of attention, that the building was warm and secure, and that morning would come soon enough. So it was that Delaney found herself sitting across a small prep table from the most feared man in Chicago, in the dim after-hours quiet of the kitchen she had come to love, and because she was who she was, because feeding people was the only language in which she had ever been truly fluent, she rose and went to the walk-in and began, almost without thinking, to make them something to eat. She worked quietly, a simple thing, eggs folded soft the way the old French cooks had taught her, bread crisped in good butter, a handful of herbs from the little pots she kept on the windowsill, and she set the plate down between them with 2 forks, and told him it was not much, but that no one should sit through a night like this on an empty stomach. Nico looked at the plate, and then at her, and something in his severe face eased, and he ate, and for a while neither of them spoke, and it was the most peaceful silence Delaney had known in longer than she could remember. It was he who broke it, and he did so carefully, the way a man crosses ice he is not certain will hold. He told her that he had eaten her cooking once before, years ago, on a night that could have ended very badly, and he watched her face change as she began to understand. He did not tell her everything, did not say that her food had held back violence, or that he had counted her among the reasons he was still breathing, only that a young chef had cooked a meal that night that he had never been able to forget, and that he had wondered, more than once over the years, what had become of her. He said it plainly, without weight or expectation, but Delaney heard underneath the even words the shape of something she had not let herself imagine, that this man had carried her, in some small quiet corner of himself, through all the years she had spent being made to feel like nothing in a cold house across the city, and she looked down at her hands, and did not know what to say, only that her heart was doing something it had not done in a very long time. They talked then, softly, of small things and large ones, of his mother, and the recipes she had left behind, of the star Delaney had earned, and the flame she had let them convince her to put out, and the hours slipped by unnoticed, until the high windows began to pale with the first gray of dawn. When the morning staff arrived at last and unbolted the doors, Nico rose and offered her his hand to help her up, an old-fashioned courtesy that felt strangely intimate in the thin new light, and they walked out through the front of the restaurant together, tired and quiet, and easier with one another than either had expected to be. And it was there, on the sidewalk in the cold, clean morning, that a car had just pulled to the curb, and from it stepped a young woman in an elegant coat, dark-haired and beautiful and certain of her place in the world, who stopped short at the sight of the two of them, emerging together from the shuttered restaurant at that hour, her eyes moving from Nico's face to Delaney's and back again, and going slowly cold. This was Vivian Marchetti, who had come that morning on some errand of her father's, and who had been raised from childhood to believe that Dominic Castellano would one day be hers, and she did not need to be told a single thing to decide, in that one frozen instant, exactly what she had seen, and exactly who the tired woman in the chef's coat was going to become to her. She smiled a smile that did not reach her eyes, and greeted Nico warmly, too warmly, and let her gaze rest on Delaney for a beat too long, and Delaney felt the temperature of the morning drop, and understood without a word being spoken that she had just made an enemy she had not gone looking for. The chance Sienna had been waiting for came dressed as the greatest opportunity Castellanos had seen in years, for word arrived that Auguste Rain, the most feared and revered restaurant critic in the Midwest, a man whose single review could resurrect a dying room or bury a great one, had accepted an invitation to dine at the restaurant and judge for himself whether the legend still had any life left in it. Nico entrusted the entire evening to Delaney, told her that this was her kitchen and her chance to announce to the city that Castellanos had risen again, and Delaney threw herself into the preparation with everything she had, designing a tasting menu of 7 courses that told the story of the restaurant's history through its food. Writing out each recipe by hand in the precise language of grams and temperatures and timings that separated a masterpiece from a mistake, and leaving the master copy of those specifications in the kitchen office for the brigade to follow. What she did not know was that Sienna, though demoted in title, still held keys to that office from her time running operations, and that she had watched Delaney's rise with a hatred that had grown from wounded pride into something colder and more patient. In the dead hours of the night before the critic's visit, Sienna let herself into the office and took up Delaney's carefully written specifications, and with the small, cruel precision of someone who knew exactly where a dish lived or died, she altered them, changing the quantities in ways subtle enough to escape a careless eye, but ruinous in the mouth. Doubling the salt in a delicate consommé, cutting the acid that would have balanced a rich sauce, shifting the timing on a fish course by just enough to turn silk into rubber, so that when the plates reached Auguste Rain the following evening, they would arrive not as triumphs, but as the clumsy failures of a housewife who had never belonged in a real kitchen. She replaced the pages exactly as she had found them and let herself back out into the night, and she went home certain that she had finally, permanently, ended Delaney Cross. But Sienna had made the same mistake that everyone who underestimated Delaney always made, which was to forget that a chef of her caliber did not merely follow recipes, but knew each dish the way a mother knows the breathing of her sleeping child, in her hands and her bones, and some deeper place beyond thought. Late that night, unable to sleep, driven by the particular restlessness that comes before a night that will decide everything, Delaney returned to the darkened restaurant to walk through her preparations one final time, and she took up her own specifications to review them, and within moments a cold wrongness crept over her. She read the consommé again, and her brow furrowed, because the salt was wrong, wildly wrong, a quantity that would make the dish inedible, and she read the fish course, and the sauce, and felt the blood drain from her face as she understood, page by altered page, exactly what had been done, and exactly who had done it. For one terrible moment, the old fear rose in her, the sense of a trap sprung and no way out, but it passed quickly, replaced by a cold clarity, because she was not a woman who had things done to her anymore, but a chef in her own kitchen, with a night still ahead of her. She did not panic, and she did not run to Nico to accuse anyone, because accusations without proof were only noise, and Sienna would simply claim it was Delaney's own error. Instead, she sat down at the office desk in the small hours of the morning and did the only thing that mattered, which was to make it right, rewriting every specification from memory in her own clear hand, correcting each poison number back to its true value, and she worked until the sky outside began to lighten, and when the brigade arrived, she said nothing of what had happened, but simply handed them the corrected pages as though nothing were amiss. But she kept the altered copy folded quietly in the pocket of her whites, and she made one small addition to the night's plan that she told no one about, a decision that would, when the trap finally closed, catch not the woman it was set for, but the one who had set it. The evening of Auguste Rain's visit unfolded like a piece of music. Course after course left the pass exactly as Delaney had intended, the consommé clear and perfectly balanced, the fish yielding like silk, the sauces singing with the acid that lifted them, and from her station Delaney watched the great critic through the small window of the kitchen door as his expression shifted from professional detachment to reluctant attention to something that in a man of his severity amounted almost to wonder. He asked to see the chef before he left, and when Delaney came out to his table, he told her simply that he had not expected to be surprised at his age, and that he had been, and he left without another word, which from Auguste Rain was the highest praise the city had ever known him to give. Sienna, who had spent the entire service coiled in expectation of disaster, watched the plates go out and come back scraped clean, with a growing horror that curdled by the hour into fury, and by the time the last guest had gone, she had convinced herself that the only way to salvage anything was to strike first. The next morning she went to Nico's office and stood before him with tears already gathering, and she told him that there had been a grave problem with the previous night's service, that the specifications had been full of errors, that Delaney had nearly humiliated the restaurant before the most important critic in the region, and had only escaped disaster by luck, and that a chef so careless with the details could not be trusted with the future of Castellanos. She said that the near catastrophe had cost the restaurant dearly in wasted product and risk, and that someone ought to be held responsible for it, her voice trembling with such conviction that a lesser man might have believed her. Nico listened to all of it in complete silence, his gray eyes never leaving her face, and when she had finished, he asked her only one quiet question, which was how she had come to know so precisely what the specifications had contained, when she no longer worked in the kitchen and had no business in its office. Sienna faltered, just for an instant, and it was in that instant that Delaney, who had been summoned and stood waiting by the door, stepped forward and set two things down upon the desk between them. The first was the folded copy of the altered specifications she had found, in Sienna's own subtle hand where she had changed the numbers, and the second was a printed still from the restaurant's security system, for Castellanos, like everything Nico owned, watched itself constantly, and the camera outside the office had captured with perfect clarity the image of Sienna Blake letting herself into that room in the dead of night before the critic's visit. Delaney did not raise her voice or gloat. She said only that she had discovered the sabotage in time and corrected it herself, that she had said nothing before because an accusation without proof was worthless, and that she had chosen instead to let the person responsible reveal herself, which was precisely what had just happened. The office went very quiet. Sienna's face cycled through a dozen expressions, denial and calculation and finally a kind of trapped animal panic, and she began to protest that the image proved nothing, that she could have been there for any number of reasons. But Nico had already risen from his chair, and when he spoke, his voice was the low, even thing that Delaney had heard once before in an alley, and it silenced the room. He told Sienna that he had extended her every courtesy she had not earned, out of respect for a past she had long since squandered, and that a person who would poison the work of her own colleagues to feed her own wounded pride had no place anywhere near the food that carried his mother's name. He did not shout, and he did not threaten. He simply informed her that as of that moment, she was relieved of every responsibility she still held, reassigned to the lowest work the building offered, the scrubbing of pots and the hauling of refuse, and that every project and every account that had ever passed through her hands would now belong to Delaney Cross, and that if she found those terms unacceptable, she was free to leave and see how far her reputation carried her in a city where the Castellano name closed doors as easily as it opened them. Sienna stood frozen, all her poison turned back upon herself, and as she was escorted out to begin her new and humbling duties, she looked at Delaney with a hatred so pure it was almost holy, and Delaney met that look without flinching, because she had learned at last that the surest revenge was never cruelty, but simply to be undefeated. In the weeks that followed, word spread through the city's culinary world of the thing that every serious restaurant coveted above all else, the Beaumont Gold Medallion, an honor bestowed each year by a panel of the region's most exacting judges upon a single establishment, an award so prestigious that it could restore a fading name to glory overnight, and draw diners from 1,000 miles to sit at its tables. For Nico, it meant more than prestige, for it was the one thing that could truly resurrect his mother's legacy and lift Castellano's back to the height it had known in her lifetime, and he set Delaney to the task of building the submission that would carry them into the competition, a complete conceptual menu that would be judged first on paper and then defended in person before the panel. Delaney poured her soul into it, working late into every night, crafting a menu that drew on the restaurant's history and her own, a progression of dishes built around a bold and unusual idea she had been quietly developing, and she kept the working documents in the office that was now hers alone. But Grant Whitmore, having watched his own family's restaurant slide toward ruin since the day he threw his wife into the street, and having learned through the poisonous grapevine of the industry that Delaney was building something that might win the medallion, had grown desperate, and desperation makes men reach for hands they would never otherwise take. It was Vivian Marchetti who reached back. She had not forgotten the sight of Delaney walking out of that shuttered restaurant in the dawn light, beside the man she considered her own, and she had been searching ever since for a way to remove the woman from Nico's world entirely, and when whispers reached her of a bitter ex-husband who hated Delaney as much as she did, she arranged a quiet meeting. The two of them made an unlikely pair across a corner table in a dim bar, the discarded husband and the scorned heiress, but hatred is a powerful glue, and they found in one another a perfect and terrible use. Vivienne had connections that ran deep, and it cost her little to have someone with access make a copy of Delaney's working submission before it was finalized, and she delivered the stolen concept into Grant's eager hands. The entire menu, the structure, the signature idea, all of it. Grant took it back to what remained of the Whitmore restaurant and assembled a submission of his own that was, in nearly every particular, a mirror of Delaney's work. The same courses, the same arc, the same clever central conceit that she had labored for weeks to invent. And then he did the one thing he believed would guarantee his victory, which was to price it lower, far lower, cutting his projected costs to the bone, so that when the two submissions sat side by side before the panel, his would appear to offer the identical brilliance at a fraction of the expense. Vivienne, for her part, had ensured that both restaurants would be competing for the same coveted place in the final round of judging, so that the panel would be forced to choose between them directly, and she smiled to herself imagining the moment when Delaney's own creation would be turned into the instrument of her public defeat, when the woman would stand before the most important judges in her world and watch a cheaper copy of her own genius be crowned in her place. What neither Grant nor Vivienne understood, because neither of them had ever truly created anything, was that a stolen menu was only the surface of a thing, a set of words on a page, and that beneath those words lay a foundation of technique and understanding that could not be copied because it could not be seen, and that in their haste to profit from Delaney's brilliance, they had taken only the shape of it and none of the substance, and had priced their theft so aggressively that they had left themselves standing over a flaw they did not even know was there. Delaney learned of the theft only days before the final judging, when a friend still loyal to her from her old life sent word of what the Whitmore submission contained, and rather than despair, she went very still and very quiet, and began, alone in her office late that night, to prepare. The final judging of the Beaumont Gold Medallion was held in a grand hall filled with the most important figures of the region's culinary world, and Delaney stood at the front of it in her whites, with Nico watching from the side of the room, his face unreadable, and across the floor stood Grant Whitmore beside Vivian Marchetti, the two of them wearing the confident half-smiles of people who believe they have already won. The panel had reviewed both written submissions in advance, and the head judge, a silver-haired woman of formidable reputation, opened the proceeding by observing with some puzzlement that the two menus before them were remarkably, almost impossibly, similar in concept, and that the deciding factor might well come down to execution and cost. Grant seized the opening at once, stepping forward to present his submission with oily confidence, walking the panel through the very menu Delaney had invented, as though it had sprung from his own mind, and then arriving with a flourish at his masterstroke, the price, which he announced was very nearly a third lower than that of Castellano's, and he spread his hands and asked the panel why they would pay so much more for the very same brilliance. A murmur ran through the hall, and for a moment it seemed the trap had closed exactly as its makers intended, and Delaney saw Vivian's smile widen and Grant's chin lift in triumph. The head judge turned to Delaney and asked, not unkindly, how Castellano's justified the difference, and whether she had anything to say in her own defense. Delaney stepped forward, and she did not look at Grant or at Vivian, but only at the panel, and she said that she would be glad to explain the difference, but that first she wished to draw the honored judge's attention to something in the competing submission that they, being judges of taste and not of engineering, might reasonably have overlooked. She asked permission to approach the panel's copy of the Whitmore menu, and she laid her finger on the central course, the one that carried the whole progression, and she explained calmly that the dish as written called for a particular technique, executed at a particular scale, and that whoever had priced this submission had done so by assuming a ratio of yield that was simply not possible with the method described. That they had calculated their costs as though the ingredient would render at a rate it could never achieve, off by a full order in their measure, and that the result was not a cheaper version of the same dish at all, but a submission whose numbers described a thing that could not physically be made. A ripple of interest passed through the panel, and one of the judges, a man who had run kitchens for 40 years, leaned forward and studied the figures, and then looked up with dawning understanding, because he saw at once that she was right, that the low price everyone had marveled at was not brilliance, but a fatal error, the mistake of people who had stolen the words of a recipe without understanding the truth beneath them. Grant's face had gone pale, and he began to stammer that it was a minor discrepancy, that it could be adjusted, but the head judge silenced him with a look and turned back to Delaney and asked her to continue. And now Delaney did the thing she had prepared alone in her office through the long nights since learning of the theft, for she had known that simply exposing the flaw was not enough, that she had to win, and so she presented to the panel a revision of her own menu that she had developed in those final days, a bold reimagining that replaced a costly traditional ingredient with a technique drawn from the new and the unexpected, a method that yielded a result more tender, more flavorful, and more beautiful than the original, at a cost that came in not merely below Castellano's first number, but below even the impossible price Grant had claimed, and she explained it with the fluent certainty of a master speaking her native tongue, walking the judges through each choice until the whole hall understood that they were watching, not a defense, but a demonstration of the gulf between someone who creates and someone who copies. When she finished, there was a silence, and then the head judge set down her pen, which those who knew her understood to be the highest thing she did, and the outcome was no longer in any doubt. The Beaumont Gold Medallion was awarded to Castellano's, and the hall filled with applause, and Grant Whitmore stood frozen in the wreckage of his own theft, exposed before the entire industry as a man who had staked everything on a lie he did not even understand. And it was everything, for Delaney would learn soon after that he had mortgaged what remained of the failing Whitmore restaurant to fund this desperate gamble, and that with its collapse he had lost not only his standing, but the very ground beneath his feet, while across the room Vivian Marchetti slipped quietly toward the doors, her face white with a fury that had nowhere left to go. The collapse of the Whitmore restaurant sent its shockwaves through every corner of the family, and none felt them harder than Sienna, who had staked her entire future on Grant's rising fortune, and now found herself tied to a man with nothing left, and the stress of it, the shouting, and the ruin, and the slow dawning terror of what she had bound herself to, proved too much for a pregnancy already fragile. She collapsed one evening at the Whitmore house, and this time there was no argument about whether to call for help, and she was rushed to the hospital in the night, with the whole family trailing behind, Harold gray and grim, Grant pale with a fear that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the one thing he still believed he possessed, the son who would carry his name. The baby came far too early, and in the frantic hours that followed, the doctors worked to stabilize both mother and child, and at last a physician emerged into the waiting area where the Whitmores paced, and explained in careful, measured words that the infant was in a delicate condition and would require a transfusion, and that the most compatible donor by far would be the child's biological father, and asked which of the men present that would be. And here, for one strange, bright moment, the Whitmore family forgot all their ruin and their disgrace, because Harold surged to his feet with something like joy breaking across his hard old face, seizing his son by the shoulder and declaring that of course Grant would do it, that whatever else had gone wrong, the bloodline would continue, that the Whitmore grandson would be saved and the family name would go on, and he spoke of the child as though its survival alone could redeem everything they had lost. The restaurant, the money, the standing, all of it made bearable by the single fact of an heir. Grant, swept up in his father's fervor and grasping at the one piece of pride still left to him, allowed himself to be led toward the room where they would prepare him to donate, and for those few minutes the Whitmores stood taller than they had in weeks, certain that fate had finally turned a kind face toward them, that out of all their disasters they had salvaged the one thing that mattered most to men like them. The nurse drew Grant's blood for the routine compatibility screening that precedes any such procedure, a simple matter, a formality, and the family waited in the corridor, trading the first easy words they had shared since the ruin, Harold already speaking of how the boy would be raised, what he would be named, how he would one day rebuild everything the family had lost. But the minutes stretched longer than a formality should take, and then longer still, and a subtle change came over the faces of the medical staff moving in and out of the room, a careful neutrality that anyone who has spent time in hospitals learns to dread. At last, the physician returned, and he asked to speak with Grant privately, and Grant, uneasy now, said that whatever needed saying could be said in front of his family, and so the doctor, choosing his words with great care, explained that the compatibility screening had produced a result that made the transfusion impossible from this donor, because the markers did not align in the way they must between a parent and a child, and that there was, medically speaking, no possibility that Grant was the biological father of the infant. The words fell into the corridor like stones into still water, and for a moment no one moved. Harold's face, which moments before had glowed with the triumph of a continued bloodline, went slack and then dark, and he turned slowly toward the room where Sienna lay recovering, and then toward his son, as though the answer to a question he had not yet formed might be written on one of their faces. Grant stood absolutely still, the color draining from him, his mouth working without sound, as the full meaning of it settled over him, that the child he had thrown away his wife for, the son he had shamed and discarded Delaney to obtain, the heir upon whom his father had just pinned the salvation of the entire family, was not his at all, had never been his, and that the woman he had brought into his home in place of the wife who had given him 5 years was carrying another man's child. And in that frozen corridor, as the joy of a moment before curdled into something unspeakable, the whole edifice of Whitmore pride, already cracked by ruin, began at last to come down. Grant could not accept it. He stood in that corridor shaking his head, insisting there had been a mistake, demanding that they test him again, that their machines were wrong, that he was a Whitmore man and Whitmore men did not have such problems, and the physician, seeing that the man would not be moved by a single result, agreed at last to run the fuller screening that Grant so violently demanded, if only to put the matter beyond dispute. And so a second set of results came back some time later, more thorough than the first, and the doctor returned once more, and this time what he had to say was not merely about the child, but about the man himself, and he delivered it with the flat professional gentleness of someone accustomed to breaking hard truths. He explained that the additional testing had revealed something about Grant's own body, a condition he had almost certainly carried all his life without knowing it, and that in the plainest terms it meant Grant Whitmore was, and had always been, incapable of fathering a child of his own. The corridor went utterly silent. For a long moment, Grant simply stared, uncomprehending. And then the meaning of it broke over him in a wave that took the strength from his legs, because in that single sentence, the entire architecture of his life collapsed. For 5 years he had stood over Delaney and called her broken, had let his father shame her and his mother pity her, had brought another woman into his home as living proof of his wife's failure, had thrown Delaney into the street with the word Barren on his lips, and all of it, every cruelty, every humiliation, every night she had wept alone believing the fault was hers, had been built upon a lie, because the one who could not give life had been him all along. Harold made a sound like something tearing, and turned away from his son as though he could not bear the sight of him, and the old man who had cared for nothing in this world but the continuation of his name stood in the fluorescent light with the terrible understanding that there would be no continuation, that the grandson he had already begun to name belonged to a stranger, and that the daughter-in-law he had cast out had been innocent of the only crime he had ever charged her with. Word of what had happened traveled, as such things do, and it reached Delaney at the restaurant the following day, and she received it not with the fierce joy one might expect, but with a long, quiet stillness, sitting alone for a while with 5 years of undeserved shame, finally lifting from her shoulders, like a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten its shape. And then she did the thing that no one who had wronged her would ever have done in her place, for she learned that Sienna, whatever her cruelty, lay recovering in a hospital bed, abandoned now by the family that had wanted only her child, alone and frightened and without means, and Delaney quietly arranged for the medicines the woman needed, and saw that her care would be paid for, and told no one, because kindness that must announce itself is not kindness at all. But when Grant came to her, as she had known he would, when he found her outside the restaurant, and fell to his knees on the cold pavement, with tears streaming down his ruined face, begging her forgiveness, telling her that he had been a fool, that he saw now what he had thrown away, that she was the only true thing he had ever had, and that they could begin again, Delaney looked down at the man she had once folded her whole life around, and she felt no hatred, only a vast and final distance. She told him quietly to stand up, that kneeling did not become him, and when he would not, she said the only thing that was left to say, that she forgave him, not for his sake, but for her own, because she would not carry him one step further into the life that was finally, wholly hers. She told him that the woman he had thrown away had died the night he put her out into the street, and that the one standing before him now owed him nothing, not anger, not a second chance, not even the courtesy of a backward glance. And then she turned and walked back into the warm light of the restaurant that bore another family's name, and she did not once look behind her, and Grant Whitmore knelt alone on the pavement in the cold, a man who had finally lost everything, and understood at last that he had thrown it all away with his own 2 hands. But the world Nico moved in had never cared for the happiness of the people caught inside it, and the same night that Delaney walked back into the light of the restaurant a free woman, a summons of a different kind was making its way to Nico. Vivienne Marchetti, humiliated at the judging and stripped of her last illusions, had gone to her father with her wounded pride, and the Marchetti patriarch had gone in turn to the one man in the city whose word still outweighed his own, Salvatore Castellano, the old Don, Nico's father, who had stepped back from the day-to-day rule of the family, but whose grip on its deepest decisions had never loosened. Nico was called to his father's house, a great shadowed place on the lake where the old man kept his court, and there in a study lined with the books and photographs of a long and dangerous life, Salvatore laid the matter before his son, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent 70 years weighing lives against advantage. He told Nico that the alliance between the Castellano and Marchetti families was older than either of them, that it had kept an uneasy peace across the city for 2 generations, and that it had been understood since Nico and Vivienne were children that a marriage would one day bind the 2 houses together and secure that peace for a generation more. He said that the time had come to honor that understanding, that Nico would marry Vivienne Marchetti, and that this was not a request. And when Nico's face hardened, Salvatore reached for the argument he had been sharpening, and he spoke of the woman, the chef, the outsider, and he said that he knew all about her. and that he knew too of the night in the cellar beneath the restaurant, when Marchetti men had come in the dark and stood a breath away from Castellano blood, and how the woman had been there in the middle of it, an unarmed civilian caught between two families who could crush her without noticing. He said that this was the proof of everything, that a woman like that could not survive in their world, that she was a weakness, a door left open, a thing their enemies would reach for the moment they wished to hurt him, and that to love her was to sign her death, and that the kindest thing he could do for her was to let her go and marry the woman whose family could stand beside them as an equal. It was a father's cruelty dressed as a father's care, and Nico heard all of it in silence, standing very still in the lamplight, and when the old man had finished, Nico did not shout, because he had never once raised his voice to his father, and did not intend to begin, but when he spoke his quiet words carried a weight that filled the whole shadowed room. He told his father that he had spent his entire life bending to the needs of the family, that he had done things and become things that no man should have to become, all in the name of the peace his father prized, and that he had never once asked for anything in return until now. He said that he would not marry Vivian Marchetti, not for the alliance, not for the peace, not for anything, and that he would hear no more talk of the chef as a weakness, because the truth was the opposite of everything his father had said, that Delaney Cross was the one thing in his hollow and dangerous life that had ever made him feel that he was still a man, and not merely a name that frightened people. He said that if there was danger in loving her, then he would build a wall around her with his own body and his own name, and that any man of any family who reached for her to wound him would learn precisely what the Castellano name still meant. And then he said the thing that no one had ever dared say in that house, that his father had spent a lifetime deciding the fates of everyone around him, and that he had never once stopped to ask whether any of them wished to be saved, and that this time, in this one thing, the choice was going to be his own. And Salvatore Castellano, who had not been contradicted in his own study in 30 years, looked at his son for a long moment with an expression no one could read, and said nothing at all. The reconciliation Nico sought with his father did not come quickly, but Salvatore, whatever his hardness, was not a man to sever a bond with his only son over a single defiance, and some weeks later he extended a stiff invitation, a gathering at the lake house to mark an anniversary of the family, and he made it known that Nico's chef would be permitted to attend, which was as close to an olive branch as the old Don knew how to offer. Delaney went because Nico asked her to, though she felt every cold and appraising eye upon her as she moved through that great house full of powerful men and their watchful wives, and she kept close to the edges of the room, quiet and observant, until the moment the evening's food was served, and something ancient and instinctive in her began, without quite knowing why, to pay attention. The kitchen that night had been staffed by outside caterers, and as the plates went around the long table, Delaney found her gaze drawn to the dish set before Salvatore at the head of it, a rich and elaborate thing dressed with a dark sauce, and some quiet alarm sounded in the back of her trained mind, the sense a chef develops over years of knowing exactly what is in a dish by its sheen and its scent alone. She saw Salvatore take a few bites while holding court over his guests, and then she saw it begin. The first small signs that only someone who had spent her life watching people eat would have caught so early. The way his hand went to his collar, the flush creeping up his neck, the sudden labor in his breathing, and while the rest of the table was still laughing at some story, Delaney was already on her feet. She understood at once what was happening, because she had spent 15 years learning every way that food could turn against a body, and she knew that the sauce carried within it a common allergen often hidden in exactly this kind of preparation, ground and folded invisibly into its base, and she knew too that Salvatore Castellano was suffering the swift and terrifying cascade of a severe allergic reaction, his airway beginning to close. Chaos broke out as the others finally realized something was wrong, chairs scraping back, voices rising in panic, guards rushing forward with no idea what to do against an enemy they could not shoot, and it was into that confusion that Delaney moved with a calm that silenced the nearest of them, calling out clearly for someone to summon an ambulance immediately, and to tell them it was anaphylaxis. She asked sharply whether the old man carried any medication for such reactions, and a startled aide produced from Salvatore's coat the auto-injector that he had been prescribed years ago for a milder version of exactly this danger, and had never once thought he would need, and Delaney, who had trained every cook in every kitchen she had ever run to handle precisely this emergency because a chef who feeds strangers must be ready for it, took it and used it without hesitation, and then she kept the failing man upright and talking and breathing through the endless minutes until the paramedics arrived, refusing to let him slip away, her voice steady and low in his ear the whole time. When the ambulance had gone, and the reaction had been brought under control at the hospital, and it was clear that the old Don would live, the truth of what had happened settled over the entire family. That Salvatore Castellano had come within a few short minutes of death at his own table, and that the only person in a house full of the most dangerous men in the city, who had known what was killing him and how to stop it, had been the outsider, the chef, the woman he had called a weakness and tried to drive from his son's life. When Salvatore was well enough to receive visitors, he asked for her, only her, and when Delaney came and stood at the foot of his bed, he looked at her for a long time with those old eyes that had weighed so many lives, and then he said, in a rough and humbled voice, that he had spent 70 years believing he could always tell the strong from the weak at a glance, and that he had been a fool, and that a woman who could stay calm and save a life while armed men stood frozen in panic was not a door left open but a wall he would be proud to have his son stand behind. He told her that he had misjudged her from the start, that he owed her a debt he could never repay, and that if his son loved her, then he would be honored, at last, to call her his daughter. There remained one thread of her old life still to be cut, and Delaney went to sever it herself, on her own terms, in the daylight, with her head high. The divorce that Grant had once flung at her like a weapon, taunting her that she had no home and no means to survive it, she now pursued with a quiet finality, and she arranged to meet him at the county office to sign the papers that would end the marriage that had ended, in truth, the night he threw her into the street. He came looking smaller than she remembered, the arrogance burned out of him, the ruin of the restaurant, and the collapse of his family, and the unbearable knowledge of his own long deception having hollowed him into something almost pitiable. And the moment he saw her, he began again to beg, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate flood. He told her that he had nothing left, that the house was gone, that his father would barely speak to him, that he understood now everything he had done, and everything he had thrown away, and he asked her, with tears standing in his eyes, whether there was truly no path back, whether the years they had shared counted for nothing, whether she could not find it in her heart to give him even the smallest chance. Delaney listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he had finished, she did not answer with cruelty, because she had discovered somewhere along the way that cruelty was the language of people who were still afraid, and she was not afraid of him anymore, was not afraid of anything he could say or do, and that fearlessness was its own kind of freedom. She told him that she had spent 5 years making herself small enough to fit inside his life, and that she would not spend 5 minutes making herself small enough to fit inside his regret. She reminded him, gently and without heat, that he had told her she was worthless, that he had told her she could not survive without him, that he had counted out to her exactly how little she was worth in dollars and in his esteem, and she said that she had believed him for a long and terrible while, and that she wanted to thank him for it, because the day he threw her away was the day she had finally been forced to remember who she had been before she ever knew his name. She signed the papers in a firm, clear hand and slid them across the table, and she said that whatever came next for him, she hoped he would learn, though she doubted it, the one lesson that had cost her so much to teach him, that a person's worth was never in what they could take from another, but only in what they were willing to give. Grant, grasping at the last card he believed he held, said then that his mother was ailing, that Margaret asked for her constantly, that surely Delaney could not simply abandon the old woman who loved her, and for the first time something in Delaney's composure softened. She told him that he was right, and that it was the one true thing he had said, and that Margaret would never be abandoned. Not by her, because unlike the rest of the Whitmores, Margaret had loved her without condition, and Delaney had already arranged to see that the old woman would want for nothing, would have the care and the visits and the small kindnesses she deserved, and that she would go on being a daughter to her in every way that mattered, in every way that Grant himself never had been a son. But she made him understand that this was a bond between herself and Margaret alone, and that it gave him no claim on her, no thread to pull, no door left ajar. She rose then, and she looked at the man she had once loved one final time, and she felt neither hatred nor longing, but only the clean quiet of a chapter fully closed. And she told him that she wished him no ill, which was true, and that she never wished to see him again, which was also true. And then she walked out of that office into the afternoon light, a woman who owed her past nothing, who had climbed all the way up from the bottom of a life meant to bury her, and who was, at last and entirely, her own. The days that followed carried a lightness Delaney had almost forgotten was possible, and it was on an ordinary evening at the close of service, with the last plates cleared and the kitchen washed down and quiet, that Nico came to find her where she stood untying her apron beneath the warm lamps. He did not make a grand production of it, because that was not the man he was, but he took her hand in his and told her simply that he had spent his whole life surrounded by people who feared him and needed him and wanted things from him, and that she was the first person who had ever fed him without wanting anything at all, and that he did not wish to spend a single day more of his life without her in it. He asked her to marry him there, in the quiet of the kitchen that had brought them together, and Delaney, who had once believed that love was a debt a woman paid with the erasure of herself, understood at last that real love was the opposite, that it was two whole people choosing each other freely, and she said yes. They married quietly, without the spectacle that a man of his position might have commanded, and Salvatore himself gave his blessing with a warmth that surprised everyone who thought they knew the old Dawn, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Delaney woke each morning to a gentle life. And then, some months into that new life, on a morning that began like any other, Delaney sat very still in the small bathroom of the home she now shared with Nico, and looked down at a truth she had waited half a decade to be allowed to believe, that she was going to have a child, that her body, the body she had been told for 5 long years was broken, and cursed, and worthless, had been whole and capable, and ready all along. She wept then, not from sorrow but from the release of a weight so old she had stopped feeling its shape, because the news was not merely joy but vindication, written in the plainest language the world possessed, proof beyond any argument that she had never once been the problem, that the shame heaped upon her had belonged all along to the man who could not bear to look at his own reflection. Word of it drifted, as all news does, back across the city to what remained of the Whitmore family, and it reached them like a final quiet verdict, for they understood, each in their own way, exactly what it meant, that the woman they had thrown into the street as barren and useless now carried a child with ease, while Grant would go through the whole of his life, unable to father one of his own, and that every cruel word they had ever spoken to her had been, in the end, a lie they had told to comfort themselves. There was no need for Delaney to say anything to them at all, because the truth had spoken more eloquently than any revenge she could have devised, and she gave them not another moment of her thoughts, for her attention now belonged entirely to the future, growing quietly within her. And on a still evening not long after, Dominic Castellano, the most feared man in the city of Chicago, a man before whom powerful people had trembled for the whole of his adult life, knelt before his wife in the soft light of their home, and laid his hand with the greatest tenderness upon the gentle curve of her belly. And for the first time in more years than anyone who knew him could recall, the cold gray eyes softened and warmed, and he smiled, truly and completely, the smile of a man who had found in the ruins of a hard world the one thing worth protecting above all else. And if you have followed Delaney's journey all the way to this moment, From the cold of that stairwell to the warmth of this new beginning, we would be so grateful if you would take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to like and share this video so that you can be here for many more heartfelt stories like this one every day. We would love to know how this story made you feel, whether it touched something deep within you, and we hope with all our hearts that you will share your thoughts and your feelings in the comments below, because there is nothing that means more to us than hearing what lives in the hearts of the people listening. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we wish every single one of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in each of your days. Until we meet again in the next video, goodbye, and take good care of yourselves.